Hello and welcome to a new episode on the War of the Rebellion podcast for Age of War. I am your host, Niels Eichhorn from beautiful North Germany. And today I'm joined again by my colleague and friend in France, Andrew Houck, who is solving some of his medical issues and ready to go full steam ahead on his dissertation writing again. So great to have you with us tonight, Andrew.
Thank
And joining us, I'm very excited about this one, is a very special person from Gettysburg, Scott Hancock. He is Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Gettysburg College, where he has worked since 2001. He has a PhD from New Hampshire, and he has done a few articles, but you might have seen him because he did a really interesting video a few years ago at Gettysburg, and he has been very active as sort of in the public eye with regard to Gettysburg. And he has been, after I saw that video from a few years ago of him protesting with Black Lives Matter flags in front of the Lee statue / Virginia Monument in Gettysburg, he has been my hero. Like, wow, this man is impossible, amazing in so many ways. So I'm really excited to have my kind of Gettysburg hero on today. So Scott, how do you feel about living and working in Gettysburg, a place of so much history and so much weird people coming through every day?
Well, I'm not going to call them weird people because
you.
I live here. I talk to them. Thanks, Niels and Andrew, for having me on the podcast. It's always good to talk with other historians who are interested in this kind of stuff and actually not just interested, but also see the relevance for what we're today, public history, that it actually matters in people's lives in meaningful ways. Yeah, so Gettysburg, if people ask me what I like living here, because I've been here for 24 years now. I grew up an Army brat, so this is by far the longest I've lived in any single place. As it's an interesting place. It's always interesting in both good ways and not so good ways. It's 7,500 people, a million tourists a year. So it's in some ways it is like a lot of small towns. Like there's a part of Gettysburg that the folks who have been here for generations, there's a part of them that function very much like a small town, and if you're not from Gettysburg, you're never going to be from Gettysburg, and they can be just as friendly or unfriendly as any other small town. Um, but then there's also this, because of the battle and the battlefield and the tourism, it's not like most small towns. So yeah, it's an odd place in some ways, but I say that in a way that I think I'd rather, if I was going to live in a small town, I think I'd rather live here than a lot of other places. So, especially as a historian, so.
Yeah, yeah. So you're still doing your daily walks on the battlefield?
Pretty regularly, not every single day, but I was out biking yesterday on the battlefield.
Mm.
So I walk a lot, ride a lot, and yeah, that's well, I know you've been here, right? It's weird because
Yeah.
it's kind of bucolic, right? It's peaceful, almost idyllic because the fields have been preserved.
Mm.
And but there are times when I'm out there walking and biking and thinking, yeah, it's bucolic because of death and
Mhm.
war and slavery and white supremacy. And, so it's this really kind of oxymoronic experience
Mm.
sometimes being out there. Sometimes the monuments and everything else are just kind of white noise, they fade in the background. And there are other days when I think, uh, this is not right.
Mm.
But yeah, but it's
Never, yeah, I wouldn't have thought about that. It's really true. And then the Park Service is over the past, well, since I started going in the 90s, they started to reestablish or redo the landscape to resemble what it looked like, what the battlefield looked like back in in the 1860s as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, which that has been a really fascinating process too, because there are so I live near the seminary, and so I can walk out my house, turn right up the alley, I go up the hill to the seminary, turn left, I'm on West Confederate Avenue, right, and out on the
Mm.
battlefield. And so
Wow.
it's in a half-mile walk, I'm out on the battlefield on federal land.
Mm.
And um and part of the places where I walk, in fact, tomorrow I'm meeting a high school group at the North Carolina Memorial. And so it's one of the first big monuments you come to when you start out on West Confederate Ave. And when you look out from there to the east, as you're heading up to it, you can see the rec park, the Gettysburg Recreational Park, that has like football field and playground and stuff like that. So, and as well as the suburb, well, it's not a suburb, Gettysburg has no suburbs. But it's a residential area with like ranch style homes that was built in the mid 20th century called Colt Park. It's where they ran tanks over in World War One, that all the, preservationists were probably freaking out because they're doing tank training over what was battlefield land. But you can see the houses and see the rec park.
Mm.
And the reason you can see them is because they cut all the trees down that used to block the view. And they cut the trees down because the trees weren't there in 1863. So they wanted to restore the sight line. So it's this kind of weird juxtaposition where, okay, so now the sight lines are there, but you can see stuff that wasn't there in 1863, right? There was no subdivision there in 1863. And we can talk about this more later too, and talk about the landscape. And so there are ways in which the landscape kind of got frozen in time in those 3 days in 1863, but it's also always changing. So I think the Park Service, and I say this not as a criticism of Park Service, I think this is one of the things they wrestle with, which is we want to make it look like it was in 1863, but by doing that, you're also going to see things, like I said, like the subdivision rec park that weren't there. So it's never gonna look exactly like it did in 1863. So it's how close can you get? But
Yeah, it's actually a great question there, Andrew, because I was thinking back, like I think I went the first time in 99 to Gettysburg. And I still remember like the old cyclorama building right behind the cemetery ridge, and then just north of it was the old visitor center.
the little
And like
house.
yeah, and like all that's gone now, it's these changes of like cemetery ridge being really restored to kind of battlefield times.
and there's some advantages in that, right? Because you can, like, now, because the cyclorama isn't there, you can understand better how when the Confederates came up Seminary Ridge and looked over, they thought Cemetery Ridge was kind of one unbroken rise to Cemetery Hill, because that's what it looks like when you're standing over there. But in reality, Cemetery Hill, there's a little dip and then it goes back up to Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and then down and then up. So before they restored all that, that wasn't as obvious. So there are ways in which their efforts to do that, I think, are really useful, but it poses other problems for them.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Google Maps image of the battlefield, of Gettysburg and the battlefield, and yeah, compared to 93, I think when the first 92 or 93 first time I went, completely different, with the cyclorama and all that, and yeah, so yeah, go continue. Sorry. I'm just looking. You're talking about the lines of sight and things like that. And even for the movie Gettysburg, it's not the same as it, in the movie Gettysburg. That was part of it was filmed on the battle.
Yeah. And of course, there are parts of the battlefield that will never be restored because there's a Kentucky Fried Chicken and a Friendlies and things like that on it, on part of what was the battlefield. And that whole subdivision that I mentioned, that was battlefield, and now there are houses on it. So there's a way in which when visitors come, that restoring it to July 1 to 3 of 1863 is accurate, and there's ways in which it's also misleading, right? Because it's not exactly like it was then.
I mean, God, you would have to build back half the town or two-thirds of the
Yeah.
town if you wanted to do that, right? So,
Well,
Yeah.
but then you also had to choose which moment you want to go back to. Do you want to go back before the battle, during the battle, after the battle? Because then you also have you have casualties. You'd have temporary cemetery. You'd have all the debris of all the remnants of this gigantic battle.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, or like the Abraham Bryan farm. Are you going to make it look like it did during the battle, all shot up, or are you going to rebuild the Bliss barn that was burned down, I think, on the second day? Um, yeah, so even before, during, or after, or even which day of the battle.
That's right. Yeah.
So,
yeah, God, like first day of the battle would probably be the hardest to restore considering the urban growth of the city.
yeah, but that's the fact that it's a. I wrote an article that will be coming out in an interdisciplinary journal this summer, a short article. One of the things that I was thinking about is how the landscape was always being changed
Mhm.
from before Europeans came, right? So we know that the different Native American nations and tribes that were in the eastern US, it's not like they didn't change the landscape at all, right? So it had been changing for centuries. And then, of course, once the Europeans come, the English and German immigrants and others, they're changing the landscape. So for thousands of years, the landscape is changing. And then because of 3 days of battle, it's more or less, the 6,500 acres have been more or less been sort of frozen in time since then. And in some places, like the peach orchard, it's what, an hour of fighting. So an hour of fighting freezes that 1 acre or few acres in time when for thousands of years it had been changing. And I'm not sure, it seems like there's something profound about that, but
Mm.
and I have some ideas on what that means to freeze a landscape in time and our perceptions of it becoming like this is what the landscape is and always has been when that's not the reality. But I'm still kind of fleshing that out.
Yeah, I mean, it is an odd situation when you think of it because, like, in most of the rest of the world, you don't do that, right? Like, you look at World War One, like, okay, we preserve maybe a little section here of Verdun or of the Somme, or we have the cemeteries, but you don't preserve the entire line of battle because it just is
Well, because it would be a
impossible.
third of France. I mean, it's huge.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a big loss. I mean, come on.
Well, not to mention the Eastern Front. I mean, so
Yeah. But I'm just doing some local history here, and it's like a battlefield that's 5 minute, 10-minute drive from my house. There's one monument and two little markers, and that's it. There's no like preservation of anything there. Like I bet if I asked every person in that village, they wouldn't even know that there were two battles that took place. So it's a rather odd and almost exceptional situation that the United States puts
yeah,
so much
and especially
effort in
Gettysburg.
that. Yeah, Gettysburg especially. Yeah.
Well, that's so, and I doing the research, this article I was reading, there's that Gettysburg was really the template for all of the other battlefield preservation sites. It was the first one that they were preserving on such scale and became the template. But it is, um, yeah, it just makes me curious. I mean, so what do you think that, uh, so in a place like Germany,
Mhm.
when I was living there as a kid in the 70s, it was West Germany, and I
Mhm.
don't remember battlefields and monuments either. I remember seeing piles of rubble that had been kind of pushed into small hills from World War II.
Mhm.
But not even that, it's not like there was any sign or anything. It was just local folks said, oh yeah, that's what that's from, um, but I mean, do you think that, I mean, is like the World War II remembered any less in those places? I mean, or it seems like it must be remembered differently somehow.
Yeah. I'm gonna want to hear about France in a minute about that
Yeah,
too. But it's I think the two wars combined and the trauma it caused for a lot of people created sort of an environment where they kind of willfully start to forget more about it. And with that, I have run into so many people in Germany and Austria who are like, oh, history is boring. Oh, I don't like history. And in many ways, because it is sort of like, oh, then I have to study that Second World War period and Nazism. And it feels like there's a lot of resistance because of that
Hmm.
among Germans. And thus then kind of a memory culture, a memory kind of landscape doesn't kind of materialize out of that.
Okay.
If you look, there is pieces of it. Like there's like 1870 has its preservation, its monuments with sort of peace trees, and World War One, World War Two soldier deaths is sort of commemorated in memorials, like the individual soldier's name engraved in rocks in sort of a central part of town or near a cemetery. Um, but yeah, beyond that, there's not a heck of a lot. And in part, I think it's losing sight, right? How do you remember that best?
Okay.
Mm.
But how's that in France?
Well, completely different.
I bet.
Um, I teach in middle school, and part of the ninth, 10th grade curriculum is, or ninth grade curriculum is World War One, goes, of course.
Oh.
And typically, our school does a trip to Verdun and places. So I'm in Poitiers, which is um, south of Tours and north of Bordeaux.
Okay.
So on the Atlantic side, um, beginning of the southwest of France, the edge of the southwest of France. So they go across the country. It's about a 7 or 8 hour drive to Verdun, and they visit. Yeah, they do European stuff because it's all part of the. Usually they integrate World War One, World War Two, the Holocaust, and the creation of the European Union as kind of a whole process.
Mm.
I see.
So World War One, the battlefields are there. World War Two, of course, because it happened so fast, the French lost, just tons of soldiers. But the battle line folded so quickly that there's not much of a landscape, a memorial landscape
Mm.
to draw from. Maybe Dunkirk
Mm.
and Calais or those places, but otherwise, um, uh, people are really interested though in World War One.
Mm.
There are a lot of associations, there's a lot of tourism for World War One, but there's also foreign tourism for World War One in France, with Americans coming over, Canadians coming over, lots of British people. So you've got these massive cemeteries, you've got these massive battlefields, you have massive monuments. The ossuary at Verdun is just incredible.
Mm.
But it's a totally different feeling than someplace like Gettysburg, where at least when I started to go to Gettysburg, the first few times that I was there, it was almost like it was like a spectacle. They had the big tower. I can't remember what it was called. The big ugly tower.
Yeah, that's not there anymore.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that observation tower thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh God, that was like, and the General Pickett's buffet and all. It was just like something out of the '60s, out of a tourist guidebook. Whereas here in France, the World War One stuff and World War Two, especially, it's all very solemn. It's all very, they have people telling you, "Be quiet." You're in a sacred place.
Mm.
Okay.
Keep it down. You don't have noisy groups. You do for World War Two in Normandy.
Hmm.
That's where you have the noisy groups and
That's where the
the
Americans show up.
yeah. Um,
That's probably a big part of why. Yeah.
yeah.
Hey, so the
But
National Cemetery, you all probably know the National Cemetery is like that. What you're describing,
Yeah.
Andrew, like if you
Hmm.
We went there we moved here, before I even knew that Gettysburg College was here. When my kids were 9, 10 years old, we came to Gettysburg, and my oldest son was bouncing a tennis ball as we were walking through the National Cemetery, and he was told, "Yeah, you can't buy a Ranger." Very politely, you
Hmm.
can't do that because but it's just the cemetery.
Yeah,
Yeah, is like what you're describing, and everything outside of it is, there's no restrictions on stuff like that.
yeah, and the video you're in, where you're, standing up with these people at the Virginia Monument, um, that would not have happened. There wouldn't have been. I mean, there wouldn't have been.
Although, so that the interesting thing on that, so later in that day, my friend, he's in the, you can see him in a little bit of the video. He's originally from Haiti. My friend Clotaire, he's a dark-skinned black man. He and I went into the National Cemetery later that afternoon, and and it was just packed with those militia folks, mostly men, mostly almost all white men. If there were any non-white men there, I didn't see them, and some women, and they had their pistols and their rifles and their AR-15s and assault weapons and whatnot, and flags and signs, and uh, and so that was on that day. It was everywhere, but there have been other times. There was one other time a group, Jen Murray, the Civil War historian,
Mhm.
organized a Second Amendment um, kind of not protest exactly, Second Amendment event later that summer. And so some people had signs, and as they started to walk into the cemetery, the rangers very politely said, "Oh, you have to roll up the signs. You can't display them in the cemetery because there's no protests, nothing like that
Yeah.
allowed in the National Cemetery." So your First Amendment rights for protest are not protected in the National Cemetery, but Second Amendment rights to carry a gun are allowed in the National Cemetery. And I don't know, that might have just been more of the Rangers were overwhelmed that day. But I suspect even now, if just one person went in the National Cemetery open carrying any kind of weapon, they would not be stopped. Um, but if you go in there with a sign, then you'll be told to put the sign away or leave.
But then there's also a line between. There's also a difference between the National Cemetery and the National Park.
Well, they're both owned by the national park. They're
Yeah,
both federal land, but yeah.
so you can have the protests and the guns at the Virginia Monument, but you can't have the protest at the cemetery.
But you can have the guns.
But you can have the guns.
Yeah. So when I hear things like that, I think this is America. But
Oh my.
yeah.
Just so I said I live in Poitiers. This is the site of three battles, by the way. I don't know if you know the battles of Poitiers.
No.
No, one of them. That was when the French knights defeated the Moors, right?
Yeah, that's okay. That's the first one.
That's a big one, yeah.
Well, oh yeah, in 732. Yeah, the second one. What is it? 507. When King Clovis, the Franks
Here's a French one.
beat the Visigoths. Um, Charles Martel, 732, and then 1356 during the Hundred Years' War, Battle of Poitiers, when the French king was captured and taken back to England taken by his cousin, taken for ransom. Um, Held for ransom in England. But so there are three different battlefields. There's
Wow.
very little on the battles themselves. There's little remaining of the battles, of course, because they're so old. But I mean, there are areas you can actually go and visit these places, and that's pretty neat. But so you can actually do some really vast historical stuff here in Poitiers, but nothing resembling anything like the World War One battlefields or anything like that, because we're so far from the eastern part of the country.
Okay.
But I mean, but if you look at the map, Poitiers is the site of three actually pretty important battles in the
Yeah.
history of Western Europe. So
I didn't
Yeah, I did
realize
not
this
know
was
they
going to be competition now.
were.
I can offer you the largest land battle in Northern Europe, which took place 20 minutes from my house.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the Frankish king who spoke German beat the Moors here. So,
There were
Anyway,
also
so
Germans in Gettysburg. Let's keep that.
That's true.
yeah. All right, let's go get back to Gettysburg.
This is great stuff about this kind of format.
Yeah.
Um, so one of the things that we wanted to talk about a little bit today is obviously we already hinted at the video, but let's go with the contemporary most pressing issue, and that's I actually just looked at the numbers the other day, and I think it's now 5 people were actually laid off. I guess that, or fired, I don't know what the right word choice here is with regard to the current administration getting rid of National Park Service staff, and Gettysburg got 5. I was shocked. Vicksburg had, I think, was it 9 people were on the list in Vicksburg? So it's pretty brutal. So what's the
How much
sense on
staff?
the that's a good question. I was trying to find that out. Maybe Scott, what's the kind of sense on the ground in Gettysburg with regard to all of this?
So everything I've heard is third hand because the Rangers that I do know, um, fairly well, they're great people, and they're also very careful about what they say in their official role as Ranger, and they always have been, but they are understandably much more careful now because I think it's an environment of fear. Um, and so that's what I've heard kind of third hand anecdotally from people who know people, or like my wife knows a few, runs into them occasionally. So is that it is a yeah, very demoralized. So the 5 people in Gettysburg were let go. My understanding is they're all more junior in their status. So it's probably not going to have a really obvious impact to the general public, not immediately, which is part of the genius of some of these firings, right? The kind of evil genius to it is many people won't feel, as far as outside, I mean, people obviously losing their jobs are feeling it right away, them and their families, but much of the public won't feel the impact of some of these things for months or maybe even a couple of years. And then they can blame it on something else. They can find some other scapegoat for the negative impact that it's going to have. But uh, and it's I've like any government, I'm sure the federal government here could use some trimming, like any business or any government, probably here and there. But there doesn't seem to be much rationale for why particular people are cut. Um, and the one thing I have heard, and again, it's anecdotal, so it can't,
Mhm.
as academics, although we hate to engage in rumor, but the anecdotes are consistent with other things that I've heard. No, so it makes sense to me. And I've heard like the Gettysburg superintendent who is recently appointed, that she is not happy with this, with the firings, and the way that it's been done, the way it's been handled. But of course, she's not going to say anything. If that's accurate, she's not going to say anything publicly. She's a federal employee. She has to answer to uh, the head of the National Park Service, who has to answer to the Secretary of the Interior. So, they're, yeah, that's, I think, probably all I can say with any kind of,
Mhm.
you know, foundation is that there's a great deal of uncertainty. My guess is the progress that the park had been making over the last several years in incorporating fuller stories, like starting to tell more stories about the enslaved people, about African Americans, and expanding it beyond just the 3 days of battle, that's probably going to come to a complete halt. I mean, it was slow before, and partly because it's the federal government, it's a huge agency, so everything's got to get approved by multiple levels. So, for instance, one quick example is there's a sign that's on top of the observation tower, not the one Andrew was talking, that got blown up a long time ago. but just one of the towers that they built back. I think it was in the 20s maybe for military training. So there's one that on Cemetery Ridge that's on the property of James Warfield, the black farmer. And so it overlooks like Pickett's Charge. You can go up there and see the peach orchard and all that kind of stuff and Little Round Top. And uh, I had suggested back in 2008 to the then Chief of Interpretation Education, I said, why don't we put a sign up there that directs visitors to think about the mountains to the east? Because visitors, they go up there and they look to the mountains to the west. They go up there and they look to the east because the east is the battlefield, which makes sense. That's why everybody comes. But if you look to the west, you see the mountains that we know escaping slaves used. And that story is part of why there was a civil war, right? Because white Southern elites and slave owners getting upset that the northern states aren't enforcing the fugitive slave laws. And this is what this Declaration of Secession of South Carolina identifies as why they're leaving the Union. So the mountains to the west help explain why there was a war and why there's a battlefield to look at in the first place. And when I suggested that in 2008, the chief ranger there then said, oh, that's a great idea. It was after the economic meltdown, so they didn't have any money, but he said, it just takes a long time and we have to decide which stories to tell. So fast forward like 8 years from that, and the Rangers had decided we want to tell those kind of stories. And in 2020, I saw a mock-up of the sign that was going to go on top of that tower to say there are the mountains to the west are freedom seekers used to come north. So it started to broaden the story and include the story of African Americans. That sign went up on the tower in March of 2024, so almost a year ago. So from the time they had the mock-up to the time it was actually up was still 4 years. And that was with people who wanted to do it, like wanted to tell these stories. So I think if it takes that long with people who are enthusiastic about it, now that we have this administration in and people are losing their jobs, especially if you're going to talk about anything that's can be remotely connected to anything about diversity, I can't imagine that over the next 4 years we're going to see any progress in those areas. And I think that's very frustrating to a lot of those Rangers.
So I find the terminology interesting as well. Freedom seekers. I think it's that really dovetails well into the narrative of the new museum.
Yes.
Freedom seeker. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was their. And I don't want to make it sound like that sign is up there just because I suggested it. There were, many people who were part of that, and they were the ones who chose that terminology, the park rangers, which I like as well. I think it's a great
as opposed to, I don't know, self-emancipated, enslaved, or
Runaways.
I like freedom seekers. It's
No, it's nice. It's makes me almost want to go back. But I kind of building on what you just said, I saw a Facebook post by one of the rangers at the Reconstruction Era Park, who was, I think he was chatting there sort of in public comments with the guy at Grant House in St. Louis area. And one of the areas that they worried about was interpretation, whether interpretation would be the big piece on the chopping block as a result of some of these cuts. That interpretation would be given like less attention or reduced dramatically.
Yeah, I think their worry is a reality. It's not just paranoia. For me, and I haven't talked to some of the Rangers that I know about this specifically, in part because I don't want to get them in trouble. I don't want to cause problems for them. But my suspicion is that what they're hoping is that what they have done up to this point doesn't get taken away. And that they don't lose the ground that they've gained, because probably over the next 4 years, they're not going to gain any more ground. And in some ways, frankly, if they don't lose ground, that's kind of a win. So.
Yeah.
Well,
no.
in the famous DEI, interpretation begins with an I as well. So I mean, they could switch that around and use that against them as well. Interpretation. We don't like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh no, you're giving him ideas here, Andrew.
Well, I saw DEI is transcribed as something else. Anyway, yeah. Anyway.
Well, but I guess that sort of we chatted briefly before this one time that it kind of raises the question that you kind of pointed to, Scott, of for whom is this battlefield, right? Who is the audience that comes here, and who should be the ones enjoying it?
Uh, yeah. When actually, even the way you phrase that, enjoying it kind of goes back to what I was saying before. It's this kind of weird experience
Yes,
where
that's why I kind of use that.
enjoy, 55,000 casualties and 7,000 people killed here, but yeah, I understand what you mean. And frankly, when I'm out on my bike on a nice day, I do enjoy it,
Mhm.
but
Beautiful. I mean, it's a
yeah,
fantastic.
yeah.
Cats and
Uh,
dogs enjoy it.
yeah. Um, but yeah, in terms of, yeah, so in one way it's I suppose your question could be answered about demographics. So is it for white Americans? Is it for
Mm.
Black Americans? Is it for men, for women, for Southerners, for Northerners? And the the initial purpose of the battlefield when it was preserved was to commemorate a decisive Union victory. And when they were starting to preserve it, they wanted to preserve it and make it a sacred battlefield so that it would teach succeeding generations how important it was to preserve democracy and the American Republic version of democracy. And so ideally that would be for everybody. Now there is a way in which when they're calling the battlefield sacred, one of the questions I ask, well, sacred to whom? Was it sacred to the enslaved laborers that the Confederacy brought with them? They probably didn't think of it as sacred.
Mm.
And I've got stories if we have time to kind of back some of that up. Um, but nowadays, so even though that original purpose got transformed to include the Confederacy and became very much a lost cause interpretation of glorifying the Confederacy along with the Union, I think the direction that the battlefield has tried to go and that the Park Service has tried to go over the last 30 years is, as you mentioned, Andrew, the new museum that went up in 2008 is to tell the story of uh, almost back to that original purpose of commemorating a decisive Union victory, and that it was important because you had a country that was divided over the issue of slavery.
That's it.
That if you take away slavery, as I tell visitors when they come here sometimes, if Africans never come to the shores of North America, this war never happens. Maybe there's some other kind of war, but the American Civil War that we had doesn't happen if Africans are never enslaved on this continent. So the Park Service wants people to understand that context and understand this battle as I think military historians would probably say it's not the single turning point, but it was an important turning point and an important decisive victory. Really, up to July of 1863, the Union had no major victories. They had some victories, but no major victories. And then you get Gettysburg and Vicksburg in the same weekend. So this is a moment when the Republic could have been really different than what it became. And that has a meaning for American democracy, has a meaning for African Americans who don't come to the battlefield in the same numbers as white folks do anywhere close. So it should be for all of them, right? As well as international visitors who come here all the time. I don't know what the stats are, but I see busloads of, I don't know exactly what country they're from, but they look like they're Korean, South Korean, and Japanese visitors frequently out here.
Mhm.
So yeah, it has lots of stories and lessons it can tell that for anybody, right? I sound a bit like I'm a pitch man for the battlefield now, right? But so
Mm.
um
Just send him a bill afterwards.
okay, all right.
It may not be fulfilled, but you can
Yeah.
try.
So, question about about the 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 actual functioning of the battlefield itself. The museum is run by the foundation.
Right.
So, what's the relationship between the foundation and the National Park Service?
Yes, I don't know the precise details, but yeah, so the museum and that land that the museum is on is owned by the foundation. So
Right.
that's the one part that's not federal land. So everything surrounding the museum is federal land, but the museum itself, and I don't know how many acres right around the museum are owned by the foundation. So the foundation is a private entity, and they do a lot of fundraising. So they operate the museum, as far as the financial part of it and the cyclorama, and they do a lot of fundraising. They sponsor a lot of events. Like they have free talks in the summer called Sacred Trust Talks with, well, I was going to say big name historians, but I was there once. I'm not sure I'm a big name historian, but they get a lot of big name historians, as well as others. And they have winter lectures that are free. So a lot of what the foundation does keeps a lot of events free to the public. And as you all know, you can come to the battlefield for free. In some national parks like Vicksburg, you got to pay to go onto the battlefield. It's not a lot. It's like $5. But so that's a lot of what the foundation does. But the Park Service, when it comes to interpretation, so when you said like function of the battlefield, Andrew,
Mm.
as far as educating visitors, the programs the rangers do, the sign-ins, all that kind of stuff, the foundation doesn't govern any of that, to my knowledge. That's all the National Park Service.
Okay.
So what about the museums then? I haven't been since the new museum track opened. So did the Park Service have say in what went into the museum, or was that the foundation doing it?
That's the Park Service.
Okay.
And the remember that the chief of interpretation education is the one who's the current chief of interpretation is Chris Gwynn, who's a Gettysburg College graduate actually, and I can't remember how many years he's been there. I think he got appointed maybe 2015 or 16. Great guy. The one who preceded him was Scott Hartwig, who you may know. He's done a lot. He's written a lot of civil. He just did a big, I think, a couple of volumes on Antietam. And remember talking to Scott Hartwig in like 2006 or seven. Ran into him at the library at Gettysburg College and asked him what he was up to, and um, he was down in the basement looking at microfilm. For those of us who used to work with microfilm and microfiche, and he said, then the story he told me was that when they decided to build this new museum, which the foundation raised the money for, but what the Park Service did is they sent the rangers, the historians, and researchers out into the primary sources, and they wanted them to take a couple of years and figure out what was the central cause of the Civil War. And so they didn't want the rangers to be reading the kind of stuff that we write. They wanted to just go into the original sources and sort of come to their own consensus and read newspapers and letters and journals and whatnot. And he said when they came back together after this couple year process, it was just so painfully obvious that it all came back to slavery in one way or another, the institution of slavery. And so that's why when you go into the new museum now, the first exhibit that you walk into is about that. It kind of sets that context. And then that thread is woven through a lot of what you go through when you walk through the museum. So that's, a long answer to your question, Nielsen, but that's, I think, evidence that it is the Park Service and the Rangers who have constructed the teaching experience, the learning experience that visitors go through when they go to the museum. So yeah, it's not the foundation that has been controlling that. So
I remember the old museum was the last time I went. I don't know when I saw it. It's been probably 30 years ago. The original museum. It was just there was the map, the light up map.
I remember that one.
everybody remembers the electric map. They said, sorry, the Rangers told me that when they built the new museum, the number one question they got was, "Where's the electric map? What happened to it?" But yeah,
Lights.
yep.
And
I actually should
the
say that
walls covered in guns, uniforms.
yeah, I remember what's the guy's name? I forget. He's in Winchester at the no, not Winchester, Middleburg, the battle down there in the valley. I forget his name now. But
Historian?
Hmm?
A historian?
No, he's a park ranger.
Oh, okay.
God, I can't even think of what's the battle now is called.
Uh, not
But
Fredericksburg.
no, it's down in the Shenandoah Valley. It's the last of it's Sheridan's big victory after snatching victory from defeat moment. Yeah.
I'm blanking too. It's
Yeah.
not the Battle of
And
South Mountain.
anyways, he was in Gettysburg for a while, and then he went down to this new park in the valley, and he was so proud that he got a lighted map to show how he got one. Gettysburg didn't have it anymore.
No.
He got one though. He was so proud of that. It was so wonderful to watch that. Um, but yeah,
Well, yeah, the story that's told, I was looking at my photos from the last time I was there in 2017, and I mean, it's just the difference is just amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
night and day. I mean, you go from, um, for me, what felt like a 1960s centennial type museum of kind of like a like a UDC type museum or like a memorial legacy hall or something, to an actual museum with a story that they're telling, with
Yeah.
an actual narrative, with an actual, you're actually guiding visitors through something to bring them to the cyclorama, to bring them through to the video. And I don't know if the video's changed, movies changed, but
Yeah, the video is not they need to update that. But yes, I agree. It is. I mean, I like any academic, I've got a few minor quibbles here and there, but it's a great museum. I think they do a wonderful job. Your listeners, viewers should know you do have to pay to go in the museum. So the park, the landscape outside the museum is free, but to go in the museum, I think it's $13 or $15, something like that for adults. So that unfortunately is not free.
yeah, it's pretty expensive if you think
Yeah.
about it.
well,
Yeah.
I mean, that's museums are always expensive, so I mean,
Yeah,
like,
but it's a national museum. When you think about the Smithsonian, think about the other national museums.
hmm? Think about how much you pay in Paris to go to a museum, Andrew. Oh, never mind. You're not paying because you're a school teacher.
Yeah, but I mean, even the Louvre is like 12 euros. I mean,
Is it? I was thinking it was more than that.
They the Gettysburg, I think I'd have to double check, but when it first opened, I think it was free or it was really cheap. But they found that they were just losing too much money operating it. So
Mm.
I think within the first year or two, they bumped the prices up a good bit. So,
Yeah. I just looked it up. It's Eric Campbell at Cedar Creek in Belle
Cedar
Grove.
Creek. Okay. Oh, Belle Grove. Yeah. There's a plantation there, I believe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's why they made it a historic site instead of a battlefield, because they had the slavery story in the valley to tell about as well.
that was a beagle trying to get into my study.
Okay.
Oh, well, I have a dog lying down there on the floor sleeping. Um, but let's also talk about the video from what was it, 2020, I think, that you
Yeah.
did at the Virginia Memorial. I'll put a link and maybe something up there will appear for those watching on YouTube. But the so people can watch that. What I was so I've shown that a number of times to my students because I always showed it in kind of the relationship to sort of Civil War memory, Civil War battlefields, kind of thinking of like the battlefield being contested grounds over reconciliation even to this day. And it always was a profound moment of sort of silence in the room after I showed that.
Really?
Um,
Oh,
yeah,
interesting.
because it always, for the students, it was sort of like they were still processing all the things that had happened that they had seen in it. And I always said, like, I mean, I don't know what Scott, like, what magic he has, but he is incredibly bold in doing
And
this.
patient.
Yeah, patient too. So in part, my first thing I want to know, how did you feel in those moments? Like what went through your mind? What was sort of what gave you the stability to like do this and withstand all these guys yelling at you?
Yeah, a couple things. Before I answer that, I do want to make clear that video is not my video. And on the YouTube it says who made it. I can't remember the name of the company, but it was two documentarians who had actually called me the day before. Because I think that was July 3rd or 4th, that
Mhm.
video. I think it was the 4th. And so they had called me on Friday, the day before. And they were doing a video, I think it's called Postcards from Babylon, about Christian nationalism in the United States. And so they had called me because another historian who knew that I'm a practicing Christian follower of Jesus and an academic. So he had given them my name. So they had wanted to talk about that. And in the course of our phone conversation, they asked me if I ever ran into people out in the battlefield. And I said, well, actually, tomorrow there's probably going to be several hundred people coming with guns that I'm going to go out and be talking to.
Hey.
And so I said, so if you want to come film it, you can. It's up to you. I don't care. And so they said, oh, we would love to come film
So
it.
you
So they,
had plans this before you knowing that you were going to be filmed.
yeah, no,
Bulletproof vest and
absolutely
all.
not. No. And that's and part of the reason I say that is because one of the things that I've gotten accused of frequently by some of the neo-Confederates is that, well, I think it's in the video, like who's supporting you, that I'm getting
Mhm.
Yeah.
backing from, George Soros or something like that. And I
Yeah.
say, man, those signs, my wife made those signs on her living room floor the night before. We went to Walmart and bought the poster board. The little Black Lives Matter flags that we pounded in the ground. My son made the little stakes for those in his little garage, his shed the day before. We printed the Black Lives Matter out on my little Hewlett Packard printer in my house. I mean, that's how well funded we are. um, and so there's no, yeah, this is, yeah. But anyway, so back to your question, as far as how we do this or goes to my at first, it did help that day because we've done this other times too when it's just me or just me and my family. That day it helped to have some friends with me, some guys who I
Mm.
had known, including the one I mentioned before, Clotaire, who had said, hey, if you ever doing something like this ever happens, let us know. We will come support you. So I called them the day before and said,
Mm.
hey, so this is what's happening tomorrow. And they showed up, so it definitely helped having other folks there. But I think two things. One, as I mentioned before, just being because of my faith as a follower of Jesus, I think, well, it's important that I see them, no matter what they believe, as people who have value and to not see them as an issue, but to see them as a human being, no matter what they say or what they do, which isn't always easy. But, so I try to keep reminding myself of that.
Mm.
Uh, and and the other thing is, so my previous career was I worked in for 14 years in group homes with teenage boys who had run afoul of the law, who are often, if they're having a bad day, could be quite angry and volatile.
Mm.
Um, so I think it's a combination of those two things. Just trying to remind myself, okay, this is a human being. That's part of the reason why, frankly, I try to ask people in those situations, what's your name? Often they don't want to tell me, just fine, but I'll tell them my name. And it's not so much because I think, oh, we're going to be good friends, or we're going to go out for a beer afterwards or whatever, but it's a way to remind myself, okay, this isn't just some angry person. Like, this is somebody who's got a name, who's got a story. I don't know why they're so worked up about this, what's going on in their lives that has brought them to this point. And maybe, frankly, maybe they're just a jerk.
Mm.
But even if they're just a rotten person, they still, it's still a human being.
Still have a name.
Yeah, and they still have a name, and I still should at least attempt to treat them with some dignity. Yeah, so that's basically it. Uh,
Wow. Yeah, that's a good approach, I think, that to kind of keep that in mind. So how long were you there? Was it just like I mean the videos I think 15, 10 minutes at most. So
yeah.
it's very short.
Yeah,
So
it's
but I
short.
assume it's like it's been at least an hour that you were there.
Yeah, so we started out at the North Carolina Monument, and actually, so we start out like 9 in the morning or something like that. And actually, when we first got there, there was hardly anybody there at North Carolina Monument. So, and for those of your listeners and viewers who have been to Gettysburg, so West Confederate Ave runs along the ridge, and it's a few miles
Mhm.
long. And the first major monument you come to is the North Carolina Monument that was erected in 1929, sculpted by Gutzon Borglum, who did Mount Rushmore, also a fan of the KKK. And there was one woman there who had a pistol, who said she was a veteran, and we were just talking to her, and she told me at one point, she said, "If I see anybody burning a flag, I'm going to shoot them." And so my question to her was, and I wasn't being sarcastic. I said, "So, do you think that a human life is worth the same as a flag?" And she wouldn't say yes or no. Hopefully part of my goal and
Mhm.
stuff like this is, I know I'm not going to change people's mind, but can you just get a few people to pause, like to think about it for
Mhm.
a second or two? And so maybe it did with her, I don't know. And so we were probably there for 20 minutes or so. And then if you leave there and you go down West Confederate Ave about a half a mile is the Virginia Monument with Robert E. Lee. Um, and Yeah, as soon as we pulled up there were motorcycles and some guys, some of the people you see in the video. And so I thought, okay, this is going to be interesting. And we weren't there that long. It was maybe a half hour, 25 minutes, half hour. I can't remember what's in the video. I haven't seen it in a few years. Frankly, I've only seen it, I think, the documentary, the people who made it sent it to me, so I watched it then. And uh, I watched it one other time, because some folks were doing kind of like what we're doing, so they wanted to talk to me about it. So I thought I should probably watch it again because it had been several months. Um, but we had put those little Black Lives Matter flags. Those are in the video, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we put them in front of each of the monuments that we went to. So the Virginia Monument, we tapped a few of them into the ground, and they lasted for about 1 minute before some of those folks, went and tore them up and snapped them in half,
Mhm.
which wasn't surprising. So yeah, it was. I mean, it's hard to know, but I don't think it was more than half an hour. Might have been a little less that we were there. Um, and then we went to the Mississippi Monument, which is further down. We weren't probably there about the same amount of time. And I think if I recall in the video, they show us driving off from the Mississippi Monument,
Mhm. This
where that
was
one
a
guy the older guy is really screaming in my face.
Oh, really? Yeah,
mm.
angry, just angry.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's an interesting cut because it seemed like you were still at the Virginia
Yeah,
Monument,
I,
but
I would have thought you were at the Virginia Monument.
Yeah.
yeah.
So the one older guy, when he's yelling, and when I'm asking him, okay, is this good history? Uh, which to be honest, by that point, I was getting a little bit frazzled and tired of just the constant screaming and yelling and
Mhm.
threatening behavior. And a few people have said to me, "Oh, when you just keep asking, is that good history? You're being so patient and so kind." And I think that's a generous interpretation because in some ways I wasn't trying to provoke him, but I think I was just being stubborn. It's
Mhm.
like 'cause he kept yelling. I just was trying to say, okay, so tell me. Basically, what I was trying to get him to say is, tell me what's wrong with this history because I
Yeah,
know the
Mhm.
history, and I know there's
yeah.
Yeah.
what we're pointing him to is accurate and sound history, as you all know. But in retrospect, I kind of wish I would have stopped and said, "Why are you so angry about this? Like,
Mhm.
what is going to change in your life if they tell a fuller story about why Mississippi seceded? Like, how is that going to affect you and your family as a person?" I doubt he would have changed anything he did. He probably would have just kept yelling. But
Well, it seemed like the group at the Virginia Monument and then that guy, um, they were raring for a fight. I mean, they were ready. They were ready to yell. And
oh yeah,
and
yeah.
I wonder if you had been white, how would the tone have changed?
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what like I can't remember what all the video catches, but they did as we were leaving Virginia, they were yelling at my friend Clotaire and I. They were yelling, "Go pick up your welfare check. Go back to Africa."
Hmm.
Uh, and some of a couple of the friends that were the other friends with us were white guys, white men, and they were kind of standing off to the side, not because they were um, trying to avoid me and Clotaire, but I think they were trying to sort of fan out to make sure nobody was going to start loading their weapons up, pointing them at us. And they said they heard people calling us the N-word. So, um, yeah, I think absolutely they were trying to provoke some of them, not all of them. And the interesting thing was the men who had the assault weapons, most of them were not verbal. They
Hmm.
and I don't think I don't recall this in the video. So when we walked up the Virginia Monument, they were all standing in a group, and then as we came out with our signs and people started yelling at us, the men with the assault weapons fanned out in a semicircle around the area, in a very military type maneuver. And
Hmm.
that was unnerving because it's like, okay, what are they planning on doing? And there weren't any police around. There weren't any Park Service rangers or anything like that. They didn't show up until we got to Mississippi Monument. Um, so their threat was nonverbal. Was body posture, obviously holding the weapons, and where they were lining up physically. The rest of the folks, the ones who were yelling, if they had weapons, they weren't, holding them in obvious sight. But yeah, I think they were looking for a response.
So wait a minute. So you're saying that you spent 30 minutes at the North Carolina, 30 minutes at Virginia, and then you went to the Mississippi, and it took the National Park Service an hour to get police to you?
Well, okay, so it might have been a little. I think North Carolina was. I think maybe it was like 20 minutes at each, 25. I'm not
It's
sure, but
still a
somewhere
long
But
time.
between.
still, that's a long time.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so in fairness to that, and that's I don't know. I've never thought of that. I don't know why I've never thought of that before, but
Mm.
uh, yeah, I don't know. I don't. So the National Park Service had called in park rangers from other parks, like they had guys there from North Carolina and probably some women too, because they knew they were going to have a lot of people there. I'm not sure they expected as many who came. I have no idea how many folks were there supposedly to protect the monuments. Not all of them armed, but a lot of them armed. And there were hundreds at least, and if not, well, into the thousands. And it's a big park, right? It's 6,500 acres, all over the place. So there were in the National Cemetery at some time. I don't know if it's the same time when my friends and I were at the monuments. There was a white pastor who walked into the cemetery with a Black Lives Matter shirt. He got surrounded by these folks. There's a video of him online too somewhere. If I can find it, I can send you a link to it. Uh, the one well, I don't know what his motives were. I don't know what he was looking to do there. But anyway, so the park rangers, I don't know to what extent they're trying to jump from one fire to another. Um, yeah, so I don't know. I don't know why it took them that long. If they just didn't have the person, enough bodies out there or what. But
Mm.
I was going to tell you though, what you don't see at the Mississippi Monument is when we left, uh, they followed us for a couple of miles. They followed us into town, um,
On the
and
motorcycles and
the motorcycles and the cars, yeah, like right behind her bumper, like roaring up and backing off, and I knew there was. So one of the guys, oh, I forgot. So there, my friend Clotaire is black, and another guy who is with us, Sean Palmer, is also an African American. They've told me whenever I talk about this, I can use their names. Um, he's a retired state trooper. This other guy, Sean, he was 25 years in the Pennsylvania State Police. So he had told me that the police had they had set up at the Gettysburg Middle School, which is where the football stadium is. I don't know if you know where that is. If you've probably driven by it, but so that's where we drove to because when they started following us, I thought, okay, we need to get someplace safe.
Safe.
So they followed us, and when we pulled into the parking lot at the middle school where the police were, that's when they took off. Um, and it actually, it's for whatever reason, oddly, that to me, and there was one other moment later in the afternoon that's not on the video because we were on the battlefield all day, was that felt more threatening than being at the Virginia Monument.
Mm.
And maybe it's because I was being naive, so at the Virginia Monument, there's a way in which it's like in the back of my head. And actually, when I was leaving my house this morning, it did occur to me, I thought, wow, like I could die today over this. Is this really worth it? And I think there's a part of probably like many people do. I just thought that's not going to happen. And it didn't, but
Mm.
for whatever reason, when they were following us in their motorcycles and the cars, that to me felt more threatening than standing there talking to people. And I don't really know why that is, but yeah.
Were they being filmed at that point as well, or had the filming stopped?
Yeah, so the filmmakers, I don't know where they went when they were following us. I don't know if they, uh, yeah, I'm not sure where they went then.
Because they might have been camera shy.
Yeah, I mean, and these filmmakers, they're great people, but it's not, uh, it's, in some ways, it's not their fight. So I can understand why if they, at a certain point, they thought, okay, we've risked it enough.
Yeah. That just, and that was just an odd summer in so many ways because of other things that went on. I do appreciate it. I think it was at the Virginia Monument, and they kind of, I think I put it into already prepped somewhat the thumbnail for today. There's a Confederate cosplayer, right? That old guy with a beard and the Confederate flag standing there, and you're kind of like,
Yeah.
Gettysburg so invites that weirdness of like, oh, let me dress up and play soldier for a little while, pretending to be on the battlefield as like a former combatant or something.
Yeah, that's every summer you'll see. I mean, the Park Service has living historians, like people who come under their guidance and will like show visitors how you fire a cannon, and so they're dressed up in gear, and for both the Union and the Confederates. But people on their own just doing that, that's every summer you might see somebody just decided to dress up. But one of the crazy things that happened that day was, and by the way, I don't. I mean, I really appreciate you saying, I'm your hero and all that. But I don't, uh, this, yeah, I don't think of myself that way at all. I think this is something I feel like, I can tell you briefly how our families kind of made a commitment to start doing this. But what I was going to say is in the National Cemetery, when my friend Clotaire and I went in that day, one of the weirdest things I saw was there was a white guy just inside the entrance with a huge flagpole. It must have been 12 feet high. And it had two big flags at the top. And one was about Trump, and the other one had like a gun on it, an assault rifle, and something about God and guns. But he was dressed as an American Revolutionary soldier. So I thought, okay, this is this kind of surreal moment, the American Revolution, which didn't happen here, right? And so you've got all of that. I thought maybe that was his intent, tying the American Revolution with the Civil War with Donald Trump in 2020. So yeah, that was, and he asked Clotaire and I remember who's a very dark-skinned black man. He said, "Hey, come take your picture with me," and we just said, "No, we're not
We're
gonna do
good.
that." But
Cosplayers.
yeah, but that was wild. That's
No,
why I
but
said it's an interesting place. It's not boring, so.
Well, and do you see any I think I've seen black reenactors occasionally when they do their parades I've seen pictures
Mm.
of black reenactors, Union, of course. But are there people who portray black Confederates?
No, not that. So, okay. So, back in 2000,
But just we know that there were no black Confederates. So Kevin,
right. Yeah.
Ben, if you listen to this, we know that there were no black Confederates.
Yeah. 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 That's probably important to say. Yeah. But,
Otherwise, we will bring somebody on to tell that part.
yeah. There was a guy who we did a thing at Gettysburg College. There was an artist who had an exhibit, the proper way to hang a Confederate flag, and it was a Confederate flag tied into a noose hanging from a gallows. And so some of the and there were a lot of death threats, and then about that too. And so I think that was like 2006 or 8. I don't remember how long ago it was. And there's a older black man who is known in those circles. I don't know he's still alive, who dresses up as a Confederate soldier and walked like several miles in protest to Gettysburg to do that. But during,
Didn't isn't that one of the guys that Kevin Levin talks about in his book?
yeah, yes, yeah, he does, yeah,
The
yeah,
the
it's the
token
same
the
guy,
token black guy.
yeah. But yeah, in 2017, when you were here, I don't know if you were here the day when all the militia folks came out with guns on July of that year, and in 2020. So it's happened twice here where we've had these hundreds of people come. As far as I know, there were no people dressing up as black Confederates, but I mean, it's a big park. There might have been, but the Black Union reenactors usually come on Remembrance Day because there's a Remembrance Day parade
Mm.
around the anniversary. It's usually the Saturday closest to November 19th, commemorating when Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address.
Mm.
And it's a big crowd. It attracts a lot of people. It's a big parade. They have the Union reenactors, and the latter part of the Union reenactors is the black men who come out as USCT troops. They always get a big applause. There's 3 moments of applause at the start of the parade. When it begins, when the black soldiers come out, and then the last third of the parade are Confederate soldiers, and they get a big applause. Uh, Myself and many others think, why are we applauding and celebrating and commemorating the black
Why are they
Confederate,
even
or I'm
why
sorry, not black Confederate, soldiers reenacting?
why are they even there for Remembrance
Yeah,
Day for Gettysburg?
I don't think they should be. So the Sons of Union Veterans are the ones who run the parade, and they invited them to participate like decades ago. So it's a tradition, but traditions can change.
Mhm.
So one of the things that we started doing a few years ago is, I didn't do it this year because of some uh, personal reasons, things going on with the family. I hated not doing it this year because I thought, I know people are going to think I'm not doing it because Trump won, and that wasn't why. But so I walk alongside the Confederate reenactors with a sign that says, "This army fought for slavery." Another sign my wife
I've
made
seen those.
that, yeah, pointing at them. And this is one of the things, and I welcome your opinion on this, because we know that often from research that when people have a bias, if you confront them with facts, often not always, but often it drives them deeper into their bias, right?
Mm.
So there's a part of it that thinks what we did on July 2020, we've done this at other times around town. Basically, our family is committed that whenever we know there's going to be a celebration of the Confederacy, we just want to provide another voice so
Mhm.
that it's not a one-way discourse. We think that's important.
Mm.
And so it's not about trying to be brave. It's not trying to get attention. It just bothers me to live in a town, to be a resident of a town that permits this lie to continue unopposed.
Mhm.
So I think we just want to provide a historically grounded option for people to consider. That's all. But I also know that, like, presenting facts like that, or like walking alongside that, in many ways, it's not the best way to get people to think. But I don't know what else to do.
Mhm.
I would love to do something else where I didn't have to do that, because frankly, I don't enjoy it. Like, I get nauseous every time we do something like this. I would much rather be home on a Saturday watching Premier League or Bundesliga. Sorry, don't watch League On, but uh,
I hate football. I hate
doing this
soccer.
stuff.
So
No, but I think that's the point, right? Of like, and that's always been the issue when people were like, when the whole kneeling stuff in football was. And I was like, well, the only reason you're paying attention to it is because you're having to see it. Otherwise, you would ignore it, right? And in many ways, that's the same with you protesting during a Remembrance Parade, because if you did it somewhere else in a different fashion, people could ignore you much better than you're in their face.
Yeah, I mean that's a
But
good point, but then how do we deal with this?
right, yeah,
The
it's not the
as
conversation
often
you
it just
want.
drives people further into it. What do you do with it?
Well, and that was pretty clear in the video as well. When you actually,
Mhm.
you read, I think you read or you cited the secession ordinances of South Carolina and
Yeah,
uh,
Mississippi. Yeah,
Yeah.
and they, I mean, they were hermetic. I mean, there was no,
Richmond papers that you cited
yeah,
too,
the
that
Richmond paper on the front page of
slavery.
the Richmond paper, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that didn't matter at all, and they were further entrenched in their ideas. Yeah, I mean, it was in their positions.
Well, I think that's the general problem, right? Of like we're living in the post-fact world, but for believers of the Confederacy, it has always been a post-fact world because, I mean, from the very moment of secession, they say, "Oh, Lincoln is going to come after our slaves," and it's like, no, in your mind, he's coming after your slaves, but he's not coming after your slaves. He doesn't have the
Right.
authority to do that, right? It's been that paranoia world they have been living in. So how do you break 170,
Well,
180 years of
yeah, but
that?
even considerably before that, I mean, since Haiti,
Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
yeah. Like, yeah, you talk about abolition, slaves rise up, like
that's it.
how do you I think there's just you keep doing it, you create conversations, and hopefully you reach a few people, and you never
Yeah.
reach everyone, that's
Yeah, and I do think
right.
like stuff we do in the classroom makes a difference. And I don't know what you all have seen, but I my anecdotal perception is that students now it is much rarer to have a student now who doesn't understand the Civil War comes back to slavery. Um, Whereas when I first started teaching 20 years ago, I'd say it was probably about half and half. 50% of the students, if you asked them what caused the Civil War, they'd say, "Oh, states' rights," and didn't really have an understanding what that was. So I know what we do in the classroom. I think that matters. It's just in those kind of public, this kind of public activist history, I'm still wrestling with trying to figure out what's the best way. I'm not going to stop doing that until I figure out a better way.
Yeah.
But sometimes I do wonder, if there are more effective ways to communicate these messages.
Well, and then um, internationally, I don't know how it is in Germany, but in France, if you ask if anyone knows about the American Civil War, they know that it was about slavery. I mean,
Really?
there's no questions asked. What was it over? Slavery. I
I
mean,
can tell you in I can tell you in Germany it's about Gone with the Wind.
really.
Yeah, which is still being shown
Yeah,
on TV. Like people still have sort of that kind of romantic, like there's offerings of like go on this cruise of the Mississippi and see these plantations, but not
Really?
not with a sense of like, oh, plantation as in this is where slavery took place. It's like there's a very romanticized perception of the United States. Um,
it's really
Oh,
interesting.
that's fascinating. Wow. I didn't realize that.
yeah, it's I like I mean there are of course some people that understand it's slavery and everything, but
Yeah.
I feel in the general public there's more of a, and that cuts towards Native Americans as well, which called total different topics that Andrew and I have to talk about, maybe do a podcast one day on.
Yeah,
Um,
traditions and yeah,
yeah, but yeah,
but
it's go ahead.
well, talking about what was the question? Yeah, France has a very different relationship to slavery, and
Mhm.
it's it's past with slavery. It typically it's become um, more honest. The
Okay.
approach has become a lot more honest, um, and so I mean it makes sense that just even my sixth graders, seventh graders know that the American Civil War was over slavery.
Hmm.
which is,
Wow.
if they know anything about it, they know Lincoln and they know slavery. And that's,
Okay. Well, they're
so,
Job well done, Andrew.
it's not me. I mean, that's what they
I
hear at
know.
home. That's what they see. I mean, if there's anything ever about the American Civil War anywhere, slavery.
oh good.
Yeah. So, I mean, at least there is some honest discourse. That's
Yeah.
that's the thing. But in the United States, it's when so when I was at Gettysburg last 2017. I think it had been on July 4th. Like you're saying, there had been a rally. I was there late July
Okay.
of 2017, and I spent some time in the archives as well. And I asked one of the archivists, John.
Uh, yeah, it starts with an H. I'm blanking on
That's
his
it.
last name. Yeah, I know who you're talking about. He just
Yeah,
retired about a year ago.
super nice guy.
Mhm.
And I said, so off the record, what's the official policy? What's the official narrative for Gettysburg? And I said, is it emancipationist? Is it unionist? Is it? I'm going from Gary Gallagher's
Mhm.
perspectives, versions, um, and he said reconciliation. I mean, it's all about reconciliation. Even though the museum was presenting slavery, putting slavery forward, it was still about reconciliation officially.
That makes sense. I can definitely see that. Yeah, that doesn't, I mean, I would not have said that if you'd asked me, but now that you say that, I think, yes, that dovetails very well with
Well,
the kind of programming and education they do.
and then I went to in 2018, 2019, I went to Chickamauga, Chattanooga, and
Ooh.
I bought a souvenir mug, as you do, and it was the official one for that year. And the big word across the mug had all sorts of words, like the word matrices that you can
Mhm.
do for keywords used, and the
Word
main
clouds.
word was reconciliation
Really?
on the mug.
Well,
Wow.
that makes sense because the park is created in many ways as a reconciliation
Yeah, but I mean,
attempt
this is
park.
2018, 2019.
Yeah.
Well, now we have to bring Lee White or Jim Ogden on the pod one day.
Yeah. I think my question for them, there's something about, yeah, so there's ways in which reconciliation sounds admirable, right? And should be
Mhm.
admirable.
Hmm.
But uh, I don't think I'm being a cynic when if I argue that that needs to be abandoned because the process of reconciliation has never been honest here in the
Mhm.
That's it.
US. And so if it's never been honest, it's never actually going to be
Right.
reconciliation, which if what we're experiencing now in the US isn't proof of that, I don't know what is.
That's right.
But uh, I'm not exactly sure what would replace it, but I
Mhm.
think they need, if that's still their mission, they need to abandon that and start over.
Well, because with reconciliation, of course, you're abandoning certain principles. You're abandoning.
Mhm. Well, yeah, and it's not, it's also was in large ways sort of a surrender of the Union
That's it.
in regard to like especially African American rights. That, oh, war's over, we want to be one country, so let them have Jim Crow in the South, let them segregate, let them disenfranchise, and then we're at least one country again. And it's like
Yeah.
anytime you build your nationhood on of a minority, I mean that just creates problems.
Yeah, and there's, I think, even ways in which no, I'm thinking as I go. So, you feel free to critique it, or your, viewers and listeners should critique it. Uh, but I'm wondering if even there's one of the critical moments is the post-civil rights era or the civil rights era and what happens
Mm.
after, uh, because that's the moment when in the 50s and 60s when the majority of white America is coming to a realization that what's happening in the South doesn't, you can't reconcile that with the
Mhm.
Constitution. You can't reconcile that with founding principles. Like they had been okay with that for 100 years, And then you get to the early 60s and they see what happens like in the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma and Emmett Till and all that. And so you have the majority of white Americans, at least outside the South, and even some in the South, who kind of finally say, okay, we can't reconcile that anymore. But so I wonder, so if that's the moment when what needed to then happen is what most white Americans say, we actually have a white supremacist nation, not just in the South, but this is a white supremacist nation. And it has been, yeah, there are these wonderful ideals about freedom and equality that have always challenged white supremacy, but we've never fulfilled that. And instead, what seemed to happen after the civil rights era was white supremacy is just going to be much better disguised. And it's going to have a kinder face. You know, we can all say, oh, the KKK, they're terrible, the white supremacists. But if we engage in mass incarceration and, you know, all these other things and residential segregation, if we still, you know, maintain that, we're not white supremacists anymore because we've said we aren't going to say the N word in public and we're condemning the KKK. And that's why I think the reconciliation, it hasn't worked because it's never been honest. And I wonder if that moment in the 60s was the moment when it could have been honest, but didn't quite get there. You know, so.
Well,
And what happens in the battlefield is a great example, right? Where you have in this dedication of South Carolina Monument when George Wallace, who's chief segregationist #1 in 1963, you know, a month and a half before the March on Washington, he stands up and says the South will continue to fight for individual constitutional rights and gets a standing ovation on the Gettysburg battlefield. You know, nobody was saying, well, I shouldn't say nobody. There were some people who were condemning that, but it's not like the Park Service was saying, now this can't happen here. You know, we're absolutely not about that. But sorry, I interrupted you. So
no. I was going to say, and then that, I mean, the reconciliation, you know, as you said earlier, the end result is today. So
yeah.
No, and as you were talking, I kind of was thinking in terms also of like, you know, I lived in Macon, Georgia for 8 years. And I still remember this guy who was gone into the schools as a teacher. And I made this comment on Facebook one time about like, if all the money that went into all these private schools actually went into the public schools, it would be phenomenal. And he kind of making this claim of like, oh, money doesn't solve everything and so on and so on. And you kind of wanted to scream at him and be like, no, this is segregation. We're segregating the school system with these public schools, and it's not good. But he just didn't want to see it. It was all other kinds of things, but it wasn't. And I guess that's the one thing, right? I hate to say it that way, but it's the one thing good about Trump being president again, that all of this racism, all of this language, all these people that are closet racists that are hiding sort of in the way they're talking about race are coming out, and we know how racist the country still is now, right? That
Yeah.
it kind of is a wake-up call of like, no, this is still a major problem and we need to deal with that.
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew. I'm sorry.
well, no, I was gonna, so just out of curiosity, besides the people who you confront who come for different who visit the park, let's say visitors of the park who come, you know, looking for a fight sometimes. Do you find is there passive? Are the townspeople of Gettysburg? Do you feel much racism from the local population?
So yeah, so another way Gettysburg is interesting. So in Pennsylvania, the way the levels of polities are, so it's a borough. So the town itself is a borough. So there's a mayor of the borough. There's a town council that governs the borough. And then beyond the borough, you have the township, and then the county, then the state, you know, and so forth. So the borough of Gettysburg is what the political scientists like to say purple. You know, it's
Mm.
a lot of Democrats and Republicans. Part of the reason it's purple is because you have a lot of the college population here, people who work for the college, as well as people in the service industry, the tourist industry. They come from all over the place. So in the borough, as far as much racism, I mean, occasionally, stuff happens occasionally, but that's going to be true anywhere. I put in a sign, a Juneteenth sign in my front yard. I live in the borough. I put out a Juneteenth sign in my front yard a couple of years ago, and within an hour after I put it in, this was a year before last, somebody drove by the front of my house screaming the N-word out the window. So that can happen, but there's also I mean there can be there are bad people everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So but I wouldn't say it's not an obvious or overt problem in many ways. But I'm also speaking my experience. I'm a light-skinned black man, so I know some darker-skinned folks who their experience they feel that more. Things happen with them more often. The Latino population, it's a different story for them. There was a college student at Gettysburg just about 2 weeks ago who some guy in an SUV pretending to be a cop stopped him and said, "Show me your papers," made him show him his driver's license and all this kind of stuff. So, depending on our position, who we are, it's going to shape our experience differently with that. You go outside the borough, it is a much, much redder area when you get out into the county. But part of it, Andrew, I think is when you say, do we experience much racism? It's kind of like, what does that look like?
Yeah,
Because
I know the question's
yeah,
vague. It's a terrible question, but
well, no, it's a fair question because I mean, people are. I have dealt with people who, as I talk to them, I think, okay, you've got a lot of racist ideas, but they're very nice, generous people. As far as how they treat you.
yeah,
And then there's folks who uh, I'm not sure they fit into a definition of racism, but the kinds of things they vote for definitely have racist results. So is that person a racist because they vote for that? If that's not their motive, but that's what the result is, so it gets complicated, I think.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. It was kind of an odd. I'm from Indiana originally, and I'm white from Indiana. So a lot of black people in Indiana, but yeah, I can't speak from my own perspective, but I know that everybody I was around was racist, just
yeah.
blatantly, openly racist. Very
Yeah.
much, very happy now that Trump is in power, and
Yeah.
like,
Folks around it.
feels-
Yeah. I mean, I think the county I live in was 75% went for Trump, and that's including the purple areas like the borough. So you get outside the borough, I'm sure it's a much higher percentage. One of my son who lives near me lives about out in the country. Um, and I have some white kids and white students who will tell me similar things that like you know, when they're around their relatives, the stuff they hear is shocking to them. But yeah,
the question again. I mean, it's one of these really terribly vague questions, and it can be, you know, yeah,
I'm going to piggyback on yours a little bit, and you're probably the wrong person to ask this, Scott. But I'm kind of curious, especially after the 2020 July videoing. How did your friends in the park, did like some of the park service guys go like, "Oh, Scott, what did you do this time?" Or
yeah,
are there any reactions like that? Or like, "Good job, keep going, but don't tell them that we say that."
yeah. And nobody said that to me. Like, good job, and don't tell me say that. I think I mean, they know who I am and know what I'm like. So uh, I would say they're response has been cautious. Well, so let me put it this way. None of the folks that I know in the park, and I, like I said, a couple of them, I mean, we're not like really close friends, but we know them pretty well, get along really well. They have never said anything to me about it. And I think that's because, th- or maybe I would just like to believe this, I think they understand why.
Hmm.
I don't think my guess is internally, they're not like, oh, I just really think he was wrong to do that. It's probably not how they would have handled it, but I don't think they want to encourage it. One of the things that I have tried to do, so a neighbor of mine suggested the next year that we make like those little Black Lives Matter flags, that we make 1,000 of those and put them in the ground all along West Confederate Ave on the anniversary of the battle, which I love that idea, right? I think that would be awesome. But I told her, I said, I'm trying to stay in the good graces of the park rangers because they're actually trying to move the needle, like I said earlier. And so I don't want to make their job harder. Uh, but I have that in the back of my mind because I think, well, over the next couple of years, like if nothing's happening, what is there to lose? Maybe that would be worth doing someday or on Remembrance Day weekend.
Or especially if they start to roll back some of the changes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. If they do that, then it's like, well, then yeah, not because I want to make life hard for my park ranger friends, but if it gets to the point where life can't get any harder for them. And in fact, this might actually help by calling attention to some of the problems here. So,
Hmm. Wow. Oh, that would be cool. Well, that would be a reason to come, like, to Gettysburg if you plan that to do.
yeah.
Just see that.
Yeah, it's a great idea. So,
Um, so we've been almost at 2 hours at this stage,
wow.
so I
Okay.
think we should wrap up slowly here, as
Yeah,
much
we
as
didn't talk
fun.
about the Politico article.
I
Oh,
know,
yeah.
and I was like wanting to trash the American Battlefield Trust at some point too, but maybe we have to do like in a few months a part two.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. We could talk about that. Or, if you want, I mean, and seriously, you can think about this. If you want to do another one in the summer, I could actually go watch the reenactment this year
Oh,
and then and
report on
not
that.
not to go watch it to make fun of them, but to go just to actually, to
Yeah.
learn, say, okay, so what's going on here, and then think about that in conjunction with the political article. But you let me know.
That would be
Yeah,
cool.
that'd be really cool, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, all right. I will tentatively plan on that. I haven't been to one of those reenactments in probably 15 years, so it would be interesting to see what it's like for me too. But
Yeah.
So just so you know, I full disclosure, I was a reenactor when I was in high
okay,
school. Yeah. And I was a Confederate reenactor.
really, why?
Well, where was I from? I mean,
Indiana?
yeah,
Well, it
full of
was a
white people who were
union.
racist. And, yeah, so of course you're going to be the cool Confederates. And we reenacted at Gettysburg in '95 or '96.
Really? Wow. Did you know if you have any Confederate ancestors?
I do,
Okay. Well, so
yeah,
that's
but they were from Kentucky. So otherwise, Union across the board.
I have talked to Confederate reenactors in the battlefield, and some of them are very much in um the Lost Cause camp. A guy from NPR came and did a show um several years ago, and I went around the battlefield with him, and he was talking to some of them, and I was kind of quiet the whole time until the guy said there were 30,000 black men who fought for the Confederacy, and then I just like, okay, no, that's just wrong. Um, but I've also talked to some Confederate reenactors, and maybe you would have been this camp, who is kind of surprised me because, like, this one guy I talked to a couple of years ago, he said, "Oh, the Civil War was all about slavery." He said, "Without a doubt." He said, "These reenactors who say it's not about slavery, they drive me nuts." So I said, "So why do you represent the Confederacy?" And it's because he's got a bunch of ancestors who fought for North Carolina regiments, and he's really into the history. So I think, okay, I wouldn't do that, but I get it,
Yeah.
So
For us,
I
it
don't
was,
think less of you, Andrew. So,
no, I mean it was, yeah, and yeah, I was up in the law. I was all mixed up in the Lost Cause as well. So I mean that was
okay.
I hadn't seen the light, but
Man, you need to
He's
write your
redeeming
story.
himself.
well, yeah, I mean, it was fun. I mean, it was a good time,
Yeah. Okay.
but ideologically, there was no reason for me to be a Confederate.
No. Have you seen the Key and Peele skit about
Yeah,
Confederate reenactors?
that's great. I love it. Uh,
Oh,
yeah, let's definitely talk about let's the
yeah,
reenactment sounds like a good.
yeah. We'll pencil that in,
Okay.
definitely.
All right. Will
If
do.
you don't mind doing it,
Yeah,
yeah,
it'd be great if we
Oh
could.
yeah. Yeah, it would be very interesting. Yeah. Okay.
yeah, certainly. Um, so final questions, each of us, right, Andrew? So
Um,
final question.
I am done with my questions.
Okay, wow, that's
I'm done because
usually Scott's thing here is when I say final question to Andrew, it's like there's 5 questions that
no, 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 no,
follow.
no, no. Like I said, I have kind of a brain fog. Um,
You're
so
tired.
yeah, yeah. So anyway,
Well, I'm gonna ask the final question then as like what would be the 3 things about Gettysburg that you would like to see changed?
Hmm. Number one, I would love to see really creative, artistic sculptures by Black artists, Black sculptors that commemorate the presence of Black people in the battlefield so that there is no way. And I'm getting this idea from a young Black man who's an architect and grew up in Gettysburg. His descendants go back to the first enslaved women in Gettysburg. Um, And he suggested to me once, we were standing at the Lee Monument, and he said, wouldn't it be something if out in the field from the Lee Monument, as you look across to Abraham Bryan Farm and George Meade and Seminary Ridge, there was like a wall of Black bodies and an arc so that there's no way that you could see Robert E. Lee without seeing Black bodies.
Hmm.
That would force visitors, it wouldn't tell visitors this is how you have to think about it, but it would force them to at least see it and consider it. So that would be absolutely number one, is something like that. And uh, probably number two would be um, at the Mississippi Monument. So my answers are probably too narrow because they're about monuments. Is when you walk up to the Mississippi Monument, there are somewhere, somehow, in huge letters, whether it's inscribed into the ground or around it, the Mississippi Declaration of Secession, where it says, um, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. So again, there's no way that visitors can engage with
Hmm.
really striking sculptors. It's the one where the one soldier's looking like he's swinging a rifle at oncoming Union soldiers, where people can't engage that without thinking, huh, so this is what Mississippi said in January 1861. So what's that mean for the statue? Uh, and I think the third thing about Gettysburg was just more park rangers like Chris Gwynn and
Hmm.
Sanders and these people we have who are just, I mean, they're such good people and they're so thoughtful and considerate. And it's not because they agree with me all the time, because there are ways in which I would love to see the story told where they would probably say, well, let's rein that in,
Hmm.
but people like that need to be protected and platformed. So,
No, amen to that. That definitely the Park Service has some excellent staff that they should do everything they can to keep.
yeah, definitely. So,
Yeah.
just a comment. You said your answers were no, but it's not a question. It's not a question. Um, I promise. I think it's interesting that you talk about monuments as your first two changes,
no.
because I mean one of the most visually striking things about the park itself is the monumental landscape,
Mhm.
Yeah, and
memorial landscape.
yeah, and it's definitely not all about monuments, but the reality is, I mean, I'm out there several times a week and I see people congregate around the monuments. So let's use them to tell us a fuller story.
I mean, they're there. They're there for a reason, and you know,
Yeah.
Right.
added context was.
Yep.
Wow. Awesome. Well, then we'll look forward to have you back in a few months after the reenactment in Gettysburg. And thank you so much for taking some time away from your grandchild today and to chat about Gettysburg and memory and all the wonderful, crazy things going on in Gettysburg.
Yeah. No, thank you very much for inviting me. I feel honored. So my privilege.
Oh, I almost forgot. We had a question. You did have one more question, Andrew, that we wanted to ask. Winfield Scott Hancock.
Oh yeah.
No relation.
Okay.
No, but the name. I mean,
so so my dad passed 24 years ago. So I can't ask him, but he never gave any indication that he had that in mind. I mean, he was a 30 years in the Army, but he never gave any indication that that's why he gave me that name. I was born in 1961. I'm not sure how much Civil War history he knew then. So I think it's really just coincidence. But
we're just curious because when I was searching for your CV and your name, and like every time I put Scott Hancock in Gettysburg, Winfield
of
Scott
course
Hancock
you
came
you got to put in minus Winfield and then search my name. Yes.
Well, so one of the jokes, the kind of side joke, we'll talk about it later.
Okay. All right.
After the recording.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you.
Sure. All right.